Welcome. Today we're taking a look at the lessons from John. And just before we begin, I'd like to give you a little bit of review of John as a writer of one of the four Gospels. John wrote mainly to the Greeks. And one of the things we need to remember about the book of John is that it really was an eyewitness account. Even though Matthew could be an eyewitness also, since he was a disciple, John seems to add details that are not in the other Gospels. And the lesson we have today, although mentioned in the other Gospels, is put in a different place in Jesus' ministry. John includes this at the very beginning of his book, which would indicate it was the beginning of Jesus' ministry. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke place this near the time of his heading to Jerusalem, or his time in Jerusalem right before going to the cross. Now, various scholars argue about this, but William Barclay says the important thing is the event and Jesus' response to the event. So let's take a look at our scripture today, which is found in John 2:13 through 25. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days? But he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. When he was in Jerusalem during the Passover festival, many believed in his name because they saw the signs that he was doing. But Jesus, on his part, would not entrust himself to them because he knew all people and needed no one to testify about anyone, for he himself knew what was in everyone. So let's take a look at some of these ideas. To see, most of us remember songs or scripture where Jesus' demeanor is totally different from what we find in this scene in the cleansing of the temple. We find Jesus erupts, would be a good description. He becomes violent even. And this is over a real dysfunctional view of religion. The Jews at this time, and it may have been a convenience thing because it was during Passover, and they were required to make sacrifices. They were also required to pay a temple tax. Now, this does not seem to be what we would call a tithe, but simply an amount of money that every male over 19 was supposed to pay. And so there were money changers because many of the people in Jerusalem were from foreign countries. And so there had to be an exchange of currency. So there were people who were there to change money. Then there were also people there to sell you something so you could sacrifice, be it sheep or cattle or doves. Now, the idea was that it would take approximately 2 days' wages to buy one of these animals to have it sacrificed. Now, you could buy out in the marketplace and it would probably be cheaper. But if you bought in the temple, the chance was that your animal would be okay to sacrifice. In other words, it was healthy. It was without blemish. But if you bought it outside, perhaps that would not be true. So most of the people came inside to make their purchases. Now let's think about it. If you remember the layout of the temple, there were various areas where different groups gathered. The outer one, where all of this money changing was going on, was called the Gentile court. And then there was the women's court, and then the men's court, and so on through to the Holy of Holies. Now, this exchange was taking place in the Gentile court and was loud and noisy and, as you might expect, smelly. So all of these conditions so angered Christ when he walked into this scene that he makes this whip and proceeds with total anger to drive people out, to overturn tables, to get behind the animals and herd them out of this court. Now you can imagine the reaction to all of this. I like it to go into a flea market where there's about to be a storm and everybody starts running and trying to cover up their goods. Now, for those of us who have been in church for years, or even those who have recently joined church, we think of church as a place for quiet reflection. We think of it as a place for contemplation. So when we see this scene that so angered Jesus, we can certainly kind of understand. I don't expect to pull up to my church on Sunday morning and find sheep and cattle in the parking lot and doves in cages and so forth. But this is exactly what greeted Jesus when he came to the temple. Now, there were various reactions at this particular time. Many of the people who were there, I'm sure, were flabbergasted at what was happening, as well as the disciples. But we know that many of them realized that this was a very unusual reaction on the part of Jesus. Now, why do you think he erupted? Well, our author tells us there are quite a few reasons that Jesus would have erupted over this. Isn't it amazing that if you study the book of Acts, as we recently did here at Grace Fellowship, you find that the original church was amazing in its simplicity. It had no real organization. For the most part, the group met to meet the needs of the group, but more importantly, to pray. Now, if we go to church and we find basically a bazaar going on outside, that is not probably going to be what we look at as a place of prayer. So this was one of the things that so angered Jesus. It was full of noise. There was no silence. Now imagine if you had been a Gentile and you were a seeker and you came into the court of the Gentiles. There was nowhere that was quiet, that was calm, that you could have met God. There was nowhere, if you had lost a loved one, that you could find solace. There was no one, if relationships had deteriorated. There was nowhere that you could have found relief from stress. So it was impossible in this scenario for any Gentile to meet God in any way. We also find that Jesus escaped for his own reflection and contemplation to places that were quiet. If you go through the scriptures from Matthew through John, you will find many times he got up early in the morning and went out to pray. And he usually didn't take anyone with him. He found time to be alone, time to reflect, time to contemplate. So we see here his anger at this situation, realizing that no one could take along with them the idea that he expresses in Matthew 11:28. Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. The second reason Jesus probably was so upset was that all that greeted him in the temple court of the Gentiles was greed. It's not a matter of justice. It was simply a matter of making money. And this involved, if I had to change currencies, the man who was doing it for me made a little on the side. If I had to pay my temple tax, then it was probably a fee, number one, that I could not afford, but the huge amounts began to stack up in the coffers of the temple. Also, if I had to have an animal, I was charged more for that animal that I purchased inside the temple grounds than the ones outside. So all of this was a chance to exploit in the name of God. Now we know that many religions around the world have taken advantage of that sort of thing. We can look back in the history of the church and find some really shameful things that have taken place. So we find that this exploitation was so upsetting to Jesus that he drives them out for this reason. Jeremiah had this to say in the Old Testament about a similar thing. Like a cage full of birds, their houses are full of treachery. Therefore they have become great and rich. They have grown fat and sleek. They know no limits in deeds of wickedness. They do not judge with justice the cause of the offering. To make it prosper, they do not defend the rights of the needy. Shall I not punish them for these things, says the Lord? And shall I not bring retribution on a nation such as this? And we can find this condemnation in Jeremiah 5. Jesus got angry because these words of Jeremiah had fallen on deaf ears. Actually, religion had become for the Jews at this particular time sort of a checklist sort of thing. People were obsessed with works, not grace. In other words, pay my temple tax, check. Sacrifice doves, check. So if all of these things were met and were expectations, then they felt like they indeed had worshiped. They were obsessed with these works and not with the grace that God had showered upon them. Our place in God's kingdom is a gift, and many have not seen this for what it is. Everyone who wants to find God can tear up their religious checklist and lean gladly into the grace of a God who loves them, even in their sins. Jesus spoke that truth on a number of occasions. But the day he raged through the temple and chased the exploiters away might have been his most eloquent and forceful word about the new way of life he came to establish. It was not a rules-based mentality, and he felt that needed to go. Now, what does this cleansing have to do with us? That's the part where we usually have to look at ourselves. We have to look at our church. We have to look at our Sunday school class. We have to look at our relationships and certainly at our own soul. Could Jesus be mad at us? I think that's something we really have to think about. Do we in our churches and our worship services usher people into God's presence? I suppose this section of the lesson really made me think about many of the churches that I had belonged to and what opportunities people had to come into calm and quiet and reflection. In a culture hooked on noise and entertainment, have we catered to that culture by making our worships loud and entertaining? Is there time in our worship for quietly pondering what really matters? If searching people come to our church, will there be enough silence for them to hear God? Or will they be so bombarded by noise and activity that they miss God completely? What we must do is focus on grace. We must realize that we have to let go of our checklist and that there should be freedom and joy in our worship. In other words, we have to cleanse our churches, our class, and our individual lives. Jesus' wrath in the temple should make us look long and hard at our church and our own part of our lives that we guard often from giving up. We hope you'll come back and be with us again next week. Thank you for joining me.